This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
It's Friday, so you all know what that means. Time to entertain some folks with the pro wrestling talk. Just like every Friday, right? It has been quite the week. Not for anything pertaining to modern wrestling. Most of that still sucks. But life. You know? Life stuff. Definitely makes the days go by faster. Then I sit down to watch Dynamite on Thursday before bed, and I'm trying with every fiber of my being not to claw my eyeballs out. Still, I'm always looking for signs of hope. The CM Punk rumors appear to be more than just rumors now, so hopefully we'll end up getting some kind of finality to that in the coming months. Because we all know what AEW is getting prepped up for this summer. And after last year's Forbidden Door debacle, I don't even want to think about the crap they're going to be spewing out on television over the next couple of months. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The AEW news has been all over the map in the last couple of weeks. The whole situation regarding the brawl-out drama circulated yet again. And yet again, it's Meltzer Magoo and sidekick Brian Alvarez stirring the pot on the Wrestling Observer and trying to present everything from a totally biased perspective. Like, not even trying to hide anything at this point. They're basically like the unfiltered CNN version of the wrestling media. Which is why I haven't been a subscriber to them in years. I still respect the work they do. You know, I'll listen occasionally to Brian's commentary. Whenever Dave can actually spit out words coherently and form sentences, I can tolerate him on occasion. But when it comes to their coverage of this CM Punk Elite story, it's been downright abysmal. We all know they're carrying the water for Omega and the Bucks. It's obvious. Anyone with half a functioning brain can see that a mile away. I think at this stage, we're just buying our time and seeing how Punk gets reinserted into the equation again. Because we've seen what the shows are like without him over the last 7 months. They're not good. Even with MJF as the world champion, hasn't been enough to save a lot of those shows. And this particular Dynamite didn't even have Orange Cassidy on it. That's the amazing thing. And again, the whole drama over the story recirculating is basically another tale of find the truth somewhere in the middle. You have to look at the people reporting on it to get a clear picture. And that's really hard to do when so many people are anti-Punk and totally in the camp for the Elite. And I've tried to be as neutral as I can. But I've also been very anti-establishment for so long now. Whenever I see hundreds and hundreds of parties picking one side and only a handful of selected people siding with the other, chances are I'm going to be wanting to listen to the smaller crew's opinion. More often than not, there's usually an underlying message somewhere in there. It's easy for everybody to jump to one party because that's where the vast majority of people go. People are kind of wired that way. Me, on the other hand, I'm not. If I see a very small subset of people choosing one party, I'm going to hear them out. I'm going to follow their line of thinking because generally there is some truth in there. And there are not a lot of pro-Punk people in this equation. A lot of them are very subdued, quiet people, but especially with the way this news has been propagated, it's embarrassing. I mean, there are very few commentators out there that have given a totally neutral, unbiased breakdown of everything that's gone down with this stuff. And the fact that we're basically at the point now where Punk's return is in limbo mode just because the EVPs are still butthurt over everything that went down last year, that should tell you something. The fact that we know Punk wants to come back, he actually wants to work with these guys. What's the problem? Punk's interested in making money off it. FTR is interested in making money off it. The problem is that Omega and the Bucks are still too insecure to deal with the fact that they didn't win the war. They think they won after Punk got suspended last year. They thought that was the end of it. Punk was gone, and the Elite could come back to television and do all their stupid trio series crap that nobody cared about. And now that Punk's name is coming back up in the conversation, they're trying to shut it down as quickly as possible. And why is anybody surprised? And at this point, it's not even about Punk and FTR making amends with the Bucks and Omega. We're long past that point. They don't need to be friends to do business together. It is a working environment. It is a professional business. Some guys are going to have to work in situations that they may not want to. It's the name of the game. There are thousands of people that show up to work every day and absolutely loathe and despise the coworkers they're surrounded with. You think every situation is sunshine and rainbows in a working corporate environment where everybody has to be friends? I'm sorry, is this like a late millennial Gen Z mindset where young people actually think that you have to be friends with the people you work with? When did that become a thing? I'm looking at this from a purely business standpoint. When it comes to the Elite versus Punk and FTR, this is AEW's only top attraction match they can do at this point. A match where you're going to get the AEW diehards and the disgruntled casual fans to plunk out money to see it. And if Tony's going to willingly blow over that and ghost the offer entirely, then he's a horrible promoter and he ought to step down from his role and hand it off to somebody competent. Because you'd be a fool to pass up on this opportunity. And if the Elite are afraid that Punk is going to shoot on them, or God forbid, they might have to wind up doing the job to Punk and FTR in Eddie's setting, you know what? Maybe those guys ought to get cut. Send them away. Fire them. Whatever you need to do. It's that simple. We don't need to have a 40-minute conversation on this matter anymore. This is old news. We know what the problem is. And trust me, at this point, it ain't Punk. The fact that he's willing to come back to work with these guys, that's enough to say, okay, that settles it. It's booked for Wembley. And the Bucks and Omega think that they're in the Hulk Hogan position where they can say, nah, that doesn't work for me, brother. Well, it works for AEW's overall bottom line, so fuck your fragile little egos. I'm telling you, man, I've been saying this on the channel very low-key for a long time now. This is what happens when you let weak, spineless, pussified men in positions of power. And they let their personal feelings dominate rational thought. I mean, even if I were in the wrong here, I would be enough of a man to admit that working with Punk and FTR is a good enough business draw to where I can swallow my pride and say, let's do it for the betterment of the company. Let's try to make some bank off this. Now, of course, I'm nothing like Kenny Omega or the Beta Bucks, so again, why would I expect any differently? So with that said, you want to talk about this Dynamite show from Wednesday night? Oh, Pittsburgh. my fellow Pittsburghers, boy, did you get sapped. I almost empathize. I've been to many wrestling shows in my heyday, and let me tell you, I've seen some clunkers. I paid to go see some clunkers. Even looking at the card and thinking, oh God, this looks absolutely atrocious on paper. But I still bought a ticket. That is how passionate of a wrestling fan I was when I was a young lad. That was also when ticket prices were reasonable back in the day. Now in Biden's economy, I'd have to fucking sell my home just to be able to afford to buy a ticket to see one of these shows. Not to mention it's the Peterson Events Center, and yeah, fuck that place. Crappy venue. And they'd have been better off booking the PPG Paints Arena downtown. Parking would have been a heck of a lot easier. But that's neither here nor there. Anyone that lives in Pittsburgh will know what I'm talking about. Regardless, glad I didn't dish out the money to go try to see this thing live. Because geez, oh man. Talk about getting stiff-armed. Tell you one thing. If I had bought a ticket for this show, and the first thing I saw on camera was Jungle Boy with a live microphone, I'd have already been out in the parking lot selling torches and pitchforks. So, well, for about the first 5 minutes of the show, literally nothing of note happened. Not essentially, not practically, I mean literally in every sense of the word. We had every opening Raw segment in the history of mankind. Somebody's music plays. They try to say like one or two words before getting interrupted. And then another guy comes down and says like 2 words before he gets interrupted. And, you know, we're all just supposed to pretend like this is spontaneously happening. Like dudes keep interrupting and we're all just supposed to presume that they're not all hanging out by Gorilla waiting for their cue. Not that I'm complaining about Jungle Boy, Sammy Guevara, and or Darby Allin getting cut for promo time. Because if you've ever heard any of those guys speak long-form promos, it's enough to put a zombie to sleep. Somewhere before any of them even spoke a word, while the commentators were jacking off with themselves like they normally do, Excalibur mentioned something about how all 3 of these guys are currently tied in AEW's ranking system. Because that's apparently a thing that people still take seriously. I thought they just kind of quietly dropped the whole rankings thing because it's been complete bullshit since day one. But now apparently they're still bringing it up. So, all 3 of these guys did some back and forth mumble jumbo jabbing. That's an artsy way of me saying they all try to cut promos to sell people on why they should be credible title challengers. The answer is none of them are. But since Tony Khan's a shitty booker and decided that Ricky Starks was too over as a babyface to push at the moment, he settled for these 3 collective wastes of human plasma. So they're doing all their middle school child play, like 3 kids fighting at recess trying to play a game of gotcha. Like I said, all in the attempt to sell themselves on why they're going to be world champion, and none of them have a case to be had. No idea who the baby faces or the heels are supposed to be because the crowd's generally kind of lukewarm to all 3 of them. They do pop for MJF initially, and then they pretend to hate him when he starts doing the Heat promo and burying the hometown. Naturally, his burial of the Pittsburgh fans was on point here, saying that we all live in a bubble where we actually think that Britt Baker is talented just because she's from Pittsburgh. To which I said, nope, not me. You can remove me from that conversation. I've long since jumped off the Britt bandwagon. I mean, I'm pretty much anti-anything in AEW's women's division at this point. It's all fucking rotten. And thank God for MJF, man. I know I say it every time, but he was badly needed here to save this thing. I had my finger on that fast forward button ready to skip through like half this promo, and I was about a split second away from going there until Max's theme hit. But the long and short of it is that MJF, by negotiation with Tony Khan, booked a three-way round-robin tournament with the three pillars to figure out who's getting the title shot. Conveniently, they also had a stagehand on standby with a hat and all three guys' names on a slip of paper to figure out who was getting a round one bye. Ended up being Darby Allin, which meant that later on in the main event, it was Jungle Boy versus Sammy Guevara. I believe Max also said, for the first time ever, which, I mean, maybe it was. I wouldn't remember if he held a gun to my head, but, I mean, I could have sworn I've seen these two wrestle a time or two before. Maybe not, though. Who really knows? They're all so generic looking. So, this is about a waste of 7 or 8 minutes with about 3 or 4 of useful material that actually had a point to it. All courtesy of MJF. The other 3 were about as useless as a fucking screen door on a submarine. And I know that line's taken. Shut up. It's funny. I mean, I was honestly just thinking about covering that match now since I'm on the topic, but I don't feel like scrolling down to my notes to figure out how far down it is. Luckily, I did not have much to say about the next segment. It was a girls' match, and I'm basically at the point now where I don't really need to even explain why. I think you can just take it as a given that I'm going to skip over most of this crap. Unless I hear or read about something revolutionary happening in the AEW's girls division, I'm just going to save my breath. We all know what we're getting. I don't care who's involved, and I don't care that Britt's from Pittsburgh. It's not enough to get me to sit through another one of these goddamn Outcast segments. The group sucks, the story sucks, everything about it just sucks. The only good thing here is that there didn't appear to be a sign of Riho. That's about where the compliment sandwich ends. But getting past that nonsense, let's talk about this Arn Anderson promo in the back with Wardlow. The year is 2023, and let the record show, former Horseman member Arn Anderson, even with the diminished tone in his voice and the energy level not reaching peak Arn from back in the day, still a better promo than virtually everybody on the AEW roster put together, outside MJF. He's not 1987 Arn Anderson like we're covering right now with the Crockett reviews. But damn it all, he's still Arn. And he's still the man. Don't you ever forget it. And while this probably was only one of the redeeming qualities on the entire show, I'll take 2 minutes of Arn cutting promos on Dynamite every week in comparison to most of the crap I see. Now, I don't know how much good it'll do for Wardlow. I mean, I think the ship's already kind of sailed on that experiment, thanks to Tony Khan's ineptitude when it comes to getting over talent. There's another butchered babyface right there in plain view. Star in the making right at his fingertips. Could have made that guy the biggest babyface attraction in the company. Instead, they beat him like a drum, fed him to Samoa Joe multiple times, had him feud with a bunch of security guards and Mark Sterling, and the rest is history. Now, if this were, say, a year ago, and they had Arn put over Wardlow in pre-tapes and talk about how he ought to be playing 4D chess as opposed to checkers, I could have made an argument for this. This might have actually worked as a pairing. But, I mean, let's call it like it is. Arn randomly showing up here in this pre-tape as a mouthpiece for literally no reason. That's what it was. I mean, it's cool to see Arn again, but why? Why is he managing Wardlow now? Because he's on the payroll? And why wait until now to do this? after you've already neutered Wardlow's push long past the point of return. That's Tony Khan logic for you. Build up something we can all invest in, yank the rug out from under it, let it kernel for like 8 or 9 months, and then randomly try to shoehorn it back into the equation and think we're all going to care again. Doesn't work like that, fella. I like Arn, but I don't even think he's going to be enough to save whatever's left of Wardlow. Speaking of things not being saved, just got done talking earlier about how Jungle Boy, Sammy, and Darby were the worst possible guys to put a live mic in front of. Apparently, some brain trust thought it would be an even better move to put a live microphone in Kenny Omega's hand. Less than 20 minutes later. Talk about deliberately going out of your way to kill a crowd. I've had more fun sitting in traffic than I'll ever have listening to a fucking Kenny Omega monologue. Droning on about God knows what in that weird ASMR voice. And once again, much like the opening promo accomplished little to nothing, the Elite all essentially came down to the ring so Omega could say pretty much nothing important. Calls out the BCC to a fight. I almost called it the BBC. God damn it, Jim. Anyway. So, they're calling out the heels, at which point Bryan Danielson appeared on the big screen for a horribly contrived pre-tape distraction. Also, Moxley, Claudio, and Flatwheel could sneak in from behind, jump these so-called baby faces, and that brawl looked about as believable as a $3 bill. Of course, the Bucks are involved, so they're doing 80,000 super kicks and flip dives and corkscrew planches. You know, the normal kind of stuff you see when guys are getting into a bar fight. This also might have been a concerted effort on their part to have the first ever Iron Man brawl angle. Because I think this thing lasted at least a quarter of the show right here. This one fucking brawl just kept going and going and going and going. And it wouldn't end if you shot it point blank with a fucking semi-automatic. And finally, it culminated with one of the most ludicrous things I've ever seen. The BCC all get Kenny surrounded in the ring, and they grab a hold of him so Danielson can tease jabbing him with a screwdriver. And because these guys are putting this shit together and they don't think about the subtleties in any way, while Omega is on the verge of having his face rearranged, out comes Don Callis with a chair, and he gets about halfway down the ramp before he just stops dead in his tracks and runs for the hills like a fucking dipshit. Now, of course, the heels are laughing at him, taking off like a coward. But it turns out, it was a swerve. No, he stopped so he could run to the back to bring out reinforcement in the form of Takeshita, who I guess finally got off the can from taking a shitta like he has for the last 7 or 8 weeks, now that Tony got bored of him. And of course, if you're wondering to yourself, the obvious, why did Don Callis run out with a chair before bringing down Takeshita to make the big save? The answer is, well, the Elite put it together and they're morons, so of course they didn't think it through. Meanwhile, I'm watching this take place in real time, and this just kind of hit me spur of the moment because I actually have a brain. But you'll be happy to hear that Omega was not mangled. He got out of there unscathed, relatively speaking. Takeshi was able to fend off all the heels with Omega, and I guess we're basically looking at these guys for whenever they decide to do their War Games match, that'll eventually suck a cock. Where or how Hangman Page fits into all this, I have no idea. Unless they're going to try to make it 5-on-5, which, in that case, I don't know who else they bring in to throw on the heels team with the BCC. I mean, it's Danielson, Moxley, Claudio, and Yuta now, going up against the Elite and Takeshita. I mean, that's 4-on-4 right there. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do. Nor do I care. But I'm just stating the obvious right now. But there was your big Indie Mark Fab Fest segment for the week. I'm sure the Elite Fanatics rub one out to that. Me, on the other hand, I just kind of sat there and shook my head after it was all over. Kind of like what I normally do after the Bucks and Omega are acting on camera. Didn't get any better from there, unfortunately. Because then we had this Powerhouse Hobbs Wardlow rematch for the TNT title. Smack dab in the middle of the show. Now with Arn Anderson in Wardlow's corner because reasons. Because they've now decided to follow up on storyline detail from when QT Marshall punched Arn in the face on Dynamite. A segment that aired, I believe, in March of 2021. When Cody fucking Rhodes was still at the company. What a cameo. My God. Talk about never being given a reason to care about anything. Following up on storylines from over 2 years ago. With QT Marshall of all people. And that was the least of our problems here. I mean, good God, where do I even start? Do I start with the obvious? The fact that this is a rematch from a previous title match these guys already had on TV a few weeks ago where, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the stipulation was falls count anywhere, no DQ. And meanwhile, this is just a straight regular match. With the usual AEW leeway, since the referees are beyond incompetent at their jobs. They did approximately 1 minute of sloppy indie moves until they rolled out to the floor and started fighting in the crowd. Meanwhile, Stephon Smith, I think that's the guy's name. Yeah, he just goes out there and starts waving his hands in the air, trying to get the boys to bring the fight back to the ring, instead of just maybe throwing the match out and trying to be an official. But, nah, he's a simpleton just like the rest of them. And we come back from picture-in-picture where Wardlow fouled out of a top rope superplex spot, and he hit Hobbs with a flipping senton. Now, of course, it wasn't the finish. It was just a move in the match. Because why would that ever be the finish for a big guy? Doing an impressive athletic move like that. Nah, let's just keep fighting. Got a million other things planned out, including all the bad angles. Also including a really bad fake clothesline spot where both guys are jockeying for position and throwing these weak-ass looking forearms to try and knock the other guy over. And after Wardlow hit a few German throws on Hobbs, the chick in the skirt that's been hanging out with QT, she hits the ring apron. Still have no idea who she is or why she exists, other than just to be another body that's sucking a paycheck out of Tony. So anyway, she hits the ring apron and just stands there. At which point, Arn then proceeds to climb up to the ring apron, and I can't even really explain what he tried to do here. He just sort of gawked at her with a, "What the fuck are you doing?" expression. It actually kind of got a chuckle out of me. Especially when Hobbs then proceeded to hit Wardlow with a double-A spine buster, and then Arn and the girl just kind of got down from the ring apron together. In unison. It's like they cued each other. They said, well, our pre-planned spot is done now. Don't want to overstay my welcome here. And, well, of course, Wardlow kicked out of the spine buster. And then we got one of the most ludicrous indie spots of all time, where QT and Arn get into the ring together while the match is still going on. The referee is not bumped. He's not blinded by spray. He's standing right there in the middle of the ring. There's QT. There's Arn. They're fighting. Referee's just standing there with dick in hand. And it all leads to Arn pulling out his fake invisible Glock to point at QT's head. At which point QT then hightails it out of the ring like a coward. I guess because he thought that Arn was about to literally pull out a pistol from his pocket. So, of course, he goes up the ramp, and he gets caught with a Lucha Brothers super kick. Because they were just casually hanging out during this match. And the super kick was able to hit perfectly enough to where it sent QT sailing about 10 to 15 feet from the ramp back into the fucking ring, where Arn caught QT with a perfectly well-timed DDT. Again, no DQ for any of this shit, by the way. Referee's just standing there letting the interference run amok. Because, he doesn't give a fuck. And why would he? From there, I don't know what happened. All I know is Wardlow hit Hobbs with a powerbomb and won. Because apparently 28 TNT title changes in the year 2023 wasn't enough. Damn it all, we needed a 29th. And just like Powerhouse Jobs' TNT title reign was swept under the rug the moment after he won it, so was he the moment after he lost it. Because within a matter of literal seconds after Hobbs lost, completely vanishes, never seen or spoken of again, and whose music should cue up but Christian Cage? And why not? Why not have Christian randomly come out to crash Wardlow's celebration? It's not like it's worth celebrating whoever the TNT champion is at this point anyway. That belt means about as much as the shit I wipe off my ass after I get off the toilet. So here comes Cage, accompanied by the dinosaur, because that pairing is still a thing. And, well, yet again, nothing happened. They did the stare down, and I guess now we're supposed to care about Wardlow versus Dino Douche. Any takers? Show of hands. Anybody actually want to see that match? Yeah, I figured. Oh, and Hobbs. Yeah, remember that guy? Deader than a fucking doorstop, that guy is. Yeah, he ain't ever amounting to anything in this business ever again. Not after that fiasco. They may as well get the gravestone inscribed now. Powerhouse Jobs. R.I.P. 2023. It's the end of the road for him. And with any luck, hopefully the end of QT fucking Marshall. Moving along here, though. We had a deal in the back where MJF offered Sammy a pay-per-view spot for the title if he laid down to eat the loss. And after Sammy told him to go pound sand, MJF gave him a blank check as a second offering, told him he can name his price, and well, he was definitely caught off guard when Sammy wrote the value down. So this is either a swerve, or MJF might have to put that marriage family thing off for a while longer. Oh, and I guess Sammy and Max are friends now, because they hugged. And we all know friends don't shake hands. They hug. By the way, MJF sold that hug perfectly. Friends? Doing that little apprehensive grin at the camera before they cut away. That was actually probably the best part of the whole show, looking back. That one little 10-second clip where Sammy and MJF are hugging and Max looks like he's on the verge of a mental breakdown. Friends? Really? Okay. Guess we are now. Or maybe that mental breakdown was just preparing us for what was in store next. It's Tony's new Play Toy of the Month, Commander versus Jay White. Yeah, just what the show needed more of. More tiny generic dudes with no personality and interchangeable masks that do all the flips and dives and couldn't have a believable wrestling match if you had them scout every piece of territorial footage you can find. And much like last time I watched Commander have a bad outlaw match on live cable TV, I got about 2 minutes into watching him butcher and fuck up rope spots left and right to where I said, I don't give a shit how good Jay White is. He's not good enough to get me to sit through a fucking Commander match. Not after last time. So I fast forwarded until Jay won with the Blade Runner, at which point they showed Shawn Spears hanging out in the crowd. To which I said, that guy still exists? When's the last time that dude was on television? A year? All of it being designed to apparently set up Jay White and Juice Robinson versus Shawn Spears and Ricky Starks. Because, yeah. Why not? That totally isn't the most random pairing of guys you could possibly pair together in a feud. Am I right? Makes about as much sense as what usually goes on with the show from week to week with the booking. On the subject of things not making sense, that brings us to this hilariously bad pre-tape in the back with FTR, Lethal, Jarrett, Sanjay, Kali 2.0, and Mark Briscoe. And while I know I just rattled off about 100 names there, allow for me to try to explain what happened here. Because I watched all of this unfold, and it was so mesmerizing, I think I actually kind of got some sick entertainment out of it. I watched it a second time through after it was over. It was so bad. Okay, so Renee Paquette is talking with FTR, and she informs them that Mark Briscoe was jumped earlier on, and apparently she just had the footage queued up and ready to go for this interview, where there happened to be a giant screen hanging out behind Dax and Cash ready to air this thing. So that was funny. And it shows, as I wrote down in my notes, some men beating up Mark somewhere in some place that I presume was in the building, but maybe not. Turns out the guys jumping Mark were the varsity athletes. And for those that don't know, like myself, or don't remember, I actually had to look this up. The varsity athletes are Tony Nese, Josh Woods, and another guy who I think was Ari Daivari, but I'm not entirely sure. I saw 3 generic-looking guys beating up Mark in the back. I just figured it was Mark getting into a fight with some hecklers in the parking lot, and somehow he lost. But no, turns out the varsity athletes are actually guys that Tony is paying right now. And Dax and Cash were approximately 3 feet away from the trainer's room when all of this went down. So they burst through the door, and there's Mark, along with Jared Lethal and company. And they're all attending to Mark while he is comically selling the back of his neck and pretending to be hurt. It's the worst acting you've ever seen before, which makes the whole thing that much more hilarious. And long story short, this all apparently set up some kind of 8-person tag with FTR, Lethal, and Jarrett versus some combination of the varsity athletes plus one more guy that may or may not end up being Mark Sterling. And I just thought to myself the minute it was over. So, in other words, what you're telling me is that the one single solitary tag feud you could actually do right now with a clear-cut face team and a clear-cut heel team, and instead of them wrestling each other, now they're going to be friends. Which then continues to lead the tag division with absolutely no top challengers to face FTR. Lovely. And I'm not making any of that up, by the way. That was a segment that aired. Totally out of the Nitro playbook. And unfortunately, FTR were a part of it. Hideously fake. Almost as fake as what happened next. Because then we had this Chris Jericho, Adam Cole face-off. You know, now that they're actually bothering to acknowledge each other's existence instead of playing the cold shoulder game like they've been doing over the last 2 weeks. So here they both are, in the ring, ready to do a promo battle of sorts. And it was... well, it was a promo face-off. Words were spoken. Mouths moved. I really tried to retain as much information as I possibly could with trying to come up with something to recap here. But the reality is, I really didn't have a whole lot to say about this after it was over. Here's pretty much everything I wrote down in my notes, and looking back, I don't think I missed out on a lot of detail. Cole put over the fact that Jericho was a childhood hero of his. Cole says that he has a lot of respect for Jericho, but he doesn't like the JAS version of him. Says that he wants the old school Jericho to come back, because that's apparently what everybody wants. And naturally, the respect was not reciprocated on Jericho's behalf. So Cole calls him a jag-off because, Pittsburgh terminology. They are the Jag-off asshole society for a reason. Cole's stealing my thunder. And it did not take too long for the segment to get stupid from there. The promo material was actually not that bad at first. But of course, the angle. And that's where this thing just completely went off the rails. They both get into a shoving match, and Cole ends up getting jumped from behind by Daniel Garcia, and the heels are beating him up in the corner until, of all people, who should come out to try and rescue Adam Cole from two grown adult men beating the shit out of him but his fucking girlfriend, Britt Baker. And I thought, oh God, seriously? The last thing they need to be doing to expose how fucking scrawny and feeble Adam Cole looks, and they got the girl running down to try to make the save for him. This ain't helping his case. And you'll be shocked to hear, when Britt finally slapped Jericho in the face, who should show up to beat the crap out of her but the Renegades. Or the Outcasts, whatever Saraya's faction the WWE rejects are. It's her, Ruby Riott, and Toni Storm beating up Britt while they got Adam Cole handcuffed to the bottom rope. And when Jericho teases that he's about to hit Cole over the head with a kendo stick, he ends up passing it off to Saraya so they can give Britt the lashings while Cole watches. And an angle like this, when done right, can actually add a lot of fuel and drama to a situation. Keywords, when done right. This was not one of those cases. Especially when the beating looked fake as fuck, and I didn't believe any of the emotion here at all. No joke, I started laughing at one point during this. When Britt's there getting whipped with Saraya giving these weak-ass looking kendo stick shots, and she's there going, Austin! Austin! Because, you know, Adam's real name is Austin. So, it's a shoot, you see? We're breaking kayfabe for this one. Who put this shit together? Russo? Just the usual when it comes to Jericho's material. We all knew he was going to latch himself onto Cole. I called that shit back in February when Cole did that return promo that never went anywhere initially. I just said, I don't know what they're going to do with him creatively, but better not fucking involve Jericho. Sure enough, here we are 3 months later. Who's the first guy Cole was working a program with? After all that time coming back from injury, one of the most over guys on the roster right now, and there's fucking Jericho, dude. Hitching himself onto that bandwagon. That egocentric, maniacal douchebag. And it didn't take too long for them to kill Cole's momentum again. Especially with the way this segment was booked. This was awful. Between the bad kendo stick shots and the girls, the bad acting with Britt and Cole, friggin' Cole having to get saved by his girlfriend when he was in trouble. This sucked. Can't really sugarcoat it any more than that. It was just a bad segment. And considering who was involved here, I wonder who had a hand in piecing it all together. Call it a hunch. Speaking of things that more than likely sucked and that I didn't bother watching, the Jag-Off Asshole Jobbers had a match with the Acclaimed and Billy Gunn. And it was getting late by this point. I was already way up later than normal having to watch this show. So I said, I want to go to bed. I'm just going to skip to the main event, watch that, and call it. Because this show about killed my buzz by the time we got here. Who won? I don't really care. At this point, Bowens and Caster are just another set of missed opportunities. And I'm not even going to pretend like Tony Khan is ever going to reconcile their bad booking. Putting him in there with Jericho's posse. Yeah, that ain't doing him any favors. I can tell you that much. But the main event was Sammy Guevara and Jungle Boy. Winner faces Darby on next week's show to figure out who's going to be facing MJF for the belt at Double or Nothing. I think that's the next pay-per-view, right? God, who even knows anymore? And of course, you look at the two guys involved here, and you should probably already know how the match is going to go before the bell even rings. Sure enough, within the first 10 seconds of the match, before I've even gotten a chance to finish typing down who's involved, we've already got 2 suicide dives out to the floor, plus a flipping corkscrew dive over the top, which I think Sammy hit after having been hit with a suicide tope like 2 seconds prior. Because again, agents are just sort of a non-factor in AEW. No one needs them. Everyone clearly knows how to lay out a wrestling match without the anchor of experienced minds telling them what to do or offering better suggestions. Clearly they don't need any of that. These guys have it well under control. Just like how they don't need help teaching guys how to throw worked punches or simple wrestling holds that might actually get a match to resemble something other than synchronized parkour, which is virtually every match that happens on this fucking show. Prior to their commercial, neither guy did one single collar and elbow tie-up, not one headlock, tackle, drop-down hip toss spot. Nothing to really sell the idea that either guy is on a level of a main eventer getting ready to wrestle for the company's top belt. It's straight to the fucking video game spots. A million flips, a million random moves. Looks like they ought to be enough to kill a guy more often than not, much less a commercial pitch. And I just keep sitting there wondering, these are 2 of the alleged futures of this company? These are the guys that are going to be carrying the load for the wrestling business 10 to 15 years from now? Godspeed to the future of AEW if that's the case. And let's be frank here. Hedging my bets now. Putting money on this. Sammy Guevara, 10 to 15 years from now, he ain't going to be fucking wrestling. Darby Allin, 10 to 15 years from now, that idiot ain't going to be fucking wrestling. Jungle Boy, I mean, maybe he'll be around. But seriously now, with the kind of match and style these guys wrestle, you really think they're going to get 10 to 15 years out of this sport? Give me a break. They won't be around long enough to make that big a difference. But now we're getting a taste of what the future could be like. Yeah. Video game style wrestling. Trading moves back and forth nonstop for the entirety of the match. Doing all the flashy, crowd-pleasing babyface spots, even though I'm pretty sure Sammy's supposed to be the heel. Not that any of that matters in AEW. There's literally no heat for anything that's going on. Just an endless cycle of back and forth moves for all the marks to fap off to. And after pretty much 7 or 8 minutes of non-stop video game choreography, the finishing spot is Sammy giving Jungle Boy a right hand from off the ring post, so Jungle Boy could go flying through the timekeeper's table. Didn't break the table, it just sort of fell over. And while Bryce is taking about 3 months to just count to fucking 10, Sammy begins molesting Bryce in front of God and everybody so that MJF can run in from behind, clock Jungle Boy with the diamond ring, lay him out and kill him. And then Bryce turns around. He sees that Jungle Boy is flat on his back in dead man's position. He kind of cocks his head sideways for a minute and then just says, 9-10, ring the bell! At which point, after Sammy wins, MJF rolls into the ring and gets on top of Sammy, and they basically start molesting each other while they celebrate. And that was it. The heels laughed at the idea that they won up the babyface. Meanwhile, Darby just kind of looked on from the rafters looking frumpy. But it sets up Darby versus Sammy for next week. I presume Darby goes over in that match somehow. And that sets up Darby and MJF for the title at Double or Nothing. That is until we hear that it winds up being a 4-way because Jungle Boy got screwed. I presume Max will find a way to screw Sammy too, and well, then the whole thing will be all for naught. Because the 4-way was a cop-out from day one, and everybody knew it. Hopefully they don't go that direction. I mean, Darby and MJF is a singles match. While I still don't really buy that Darby is a credible title challenger right now, it makes the most sense out of the 3 challengers currently. Still makes less sense than Ricky Starks, but apparently Tony figured it'd be more productive to shoehorn him into a program with Juicy Fruit and Jay White, with blank slate personality Sean Spears as his partner. Because that'll get the people roaring. So who really knows what they're going to do? I mean, I don't know. Quite frankly, I'm really sour on the idea of a 4-way. Darby and MJF for the title, that could work. You know, if that means Jungle Boy and Sammy end up doing a rematch at the Double or Nothing pay-per-view, fine, whatever. Just keep them away from the title picture, for the love of God. I don't know. I didn't even hate this show. That's the funny thing. It sucked. I was very glad I didn't buy a ticket for this thing in advance, knowing what I was evidently going to get. Like, why waste the money? Like MJF joked about in the opener, the only hometown hero the AEW fans have to latch onto in Pittsburgh is Britt, and she's nothing special. She's hot, but so what? And the more I watch of this show, man, the more I'm hoping those rumors about an AEW brand split with a second Saturday show are more than just rumors. If FTR, Punk, and MJF don't want to work under the same roof as all the grade school kids, let them all lead the charge in a second show, devoid of any problems. You keep the camps separate from each other. They can take the boys that actually have a passion to get better in the business and move over to that side. Meanwhile, the Bucks and Omega can continue to play with all their friends on Dynamite, and we can just fucking watch those ratings fall like boulders. And by that point, we'll pretty much know who the remaining AEW loyalists are. The ones that voluntarily stick around to watch all that elite crap every week. which is a very, very small subset of people, I assure you. In the meantime, Raw rolls on. Oh, Christ, don't even get me started. But at least we have Crockett TV to save the day. And what a great way to start the show. If you watched my 87 Crockett Cup rundown last week, you'll remember the one thing I talked about after we covered the finals of the tournament with Dusty and Nikita going over Tully and Luger. The one thing I was disappointed with was that they never showed the footage of Magnum TA coming down to embrace Dusty and Nikita. Well, the YouTube footage did not show that. And we got it here in the opening VTR. And it was perfect. It was like 2 minutes of total time they spent showing it, but man, the emotion that poured out of that 2-minute snippet, it was enough to make even an Undertaker cry. And no, I don't mean Mark Calloway. You know, there's Magnum coming down the aisleway, led by Pee Wee Anderson and Teddy Long. You know, he's obviously got the arm cast on, and you could tell he's physically beat up. But the outpoured cheers that people gave that guy, like in that one moment, Magnum was the biggest star in the history of the business. And you could tell how choked up he was. And here comes Dusty and Nikita shortly thereafter to hug him down at ringside. It's one of those TV moments that if you grew up watching around the time, that's a moment you remember where you know exactly where you are the moment it happens. You remember what room you're in. You remember who was with you, the whole deal. That's a wrestling moment people still talk about to this day. It's so iconic. Just the visual of seeing Magnum back on camera, going out there to endorse his two best friends after they just won the 87 Crockett Cup. It's an all-time classic moment for a variety of reasons. I just wish I could have seen it live to understand what people were going through at the time. And it's even sadder when you realize that Magnum never wrestled a day in his life after the fact. Even by this point in 87, I guarantee you there were probably hundreds of thousands of fans around the country that really thought this guy was going to wrestle again. And when you realize it never happened, it just breaks your heart that much more. To see Magnum out there embracing his friends, effectively knowing that this was the end of the road for him. But to give him that moment here in Baltimore in front of all those people, man, what a truly special moment that had to have been for him. I mean, you could tell he treasured every second he was out there. It was David Crockett's highlight of the entire show, that's for sure. I think he said, the greatest moment of his career. Now, I know David exaggerates a lot when it comes to his commentary on the studio shows, but I wouldn't doubt him. And on the subject of the Crockett Cup, they sort of ran down the theme for this week's show. They were going to show highlight packages later on in the program to catch everybody up to speed on what happened. And we also now know what the current plan is for the U.S. tag belts. Since Dick Murdoch was stripped of his half of the titles due to the angle they shot where he pow drove Nikita on the concrete floor, they're now going to be hosting a tournament to crown new U.S. tag champions. And that tournament will begin on next week's TBS episode. And what better spokesperson to speak on behalf of the U.S. tag titles but good old Jim Cornette, manager of the greatest tag team of all time, introducing the Midnight Express for the opening bout on this week's show as they took on Alan Martin and David Diamond. And if you've been following along in the Crockett reviews, yes, this is now the new Midnight Express, as Dennis Condrey had already departed the company by this point, and Sweet Stan was brought in to replace him. Sweet Stan rocking the sweet tart colored ring trunks here. I believe the only man since Bret the Hitman Hart that I could ever see pull off purple and pink ring trunks and still look masculine. No offense to beautiful Bobby, who was also wearing pink here, but no. Not a good look for him. And already, we got Cornette flaunting the conspiracy theory tale about the Midnights getting fucked over by Jim Crockett in the tournament for a second year in a row by having to square up against the Road Warriors. All the while, the announcers are dangling the Ronnie Garvin problem over his head, talking about how the day is going to come when Ronnie gets corny in that cage. And, man, you watch a match like this and you think to yourself, it really didn't take Bobby and Stan all that long to get the chemistry down, did it? That rocket launcher finisher at the end was superb. You know, Stan actually almost launched over Bobby. That's how much momentum he got. And, you know, if you couldn't already see the writing on the wall with who was going over in that tag title tournament, I mean, I really don't know what else to tell you. I'm still amazed it took them this long to get the belts on Bobby and Stan. My whole memory of the U.S. tag titles and Crockett Promotions kind of starts with the moment the Midnight Express were the champions. Like, obviously, I remember all the work they did with the Fantastics later on, but that whole initial 5 or 6 month period where they kept flip-flopping the belts between the Russians and Ronnie and Barry, you know, especially with hearing how Dusty basically created the belt specifically for the Midnights, since they weren't being factored into the world tag title equation for the foreseeable future. He just wanted them to have a set of belts. And that's basically what Corny did in the follow-up promo, just blurting out the obvious that Sweet Stan and Beautiful Bobby were going to win the whole dang tournament and solidify themselves as the best tag team in wrestling today. Meanwhile, Corny is still on his mission to get his lawyers to overturn the cage match with Ronnie Garvin that Jim Crockett is trying to book for next month, I believe. And while sweat is dripping from Cornette's face here, you got Bobby and Stan wiping off the sweat from his face mid-promo, which was kind of funny. And he basically just vowed that he'll never allow himself to get inside that cage with Ronnie, because even Cornette is willing to admit that it wouldn't wind up well for him. And all the while, David Crockett is giddier than a fucking pig in shit to see that match go down. As is the entire studio, for that matter. You know what match I wasn't giddy to see? Vladimir Petrov and Ivan Koloff versus Mike Force and Russ Taylor. Talk about the epitome of sucking all the air out of the room. Especially after the first 12 minutes. Then they come back from break for this. The best part was listening to the fans heckle Pietrov's offense and yell that Nikita does the sickle better. To which I said, I think Nikita Koloff does everything better than Vladimir Petrov ever did. Hence why his career was so short-lived. Anyway, this match was grotesquely boring. By the time it was over, I think the dinosaurs were extinct and born again. And the Russians won with a combination backbreaker elbow drop. I believe I also heard David somewhere here assert that Pietrov's arms were the size of telephone poles. To which I asked, by what dimensions? Length? Width? Depth? Because I've seen telephone poles before. I usually do not affiliate them with arm size. Not unless the guy's fucking 9'8". And I'm yet to meet somebody that's over 9 feet tall. But I'll keep my eyes peeled. So following that, we cut to the booth with Tim Horner and Ole Anderson. And Horner's talking about the Four Horsemen and how he and Ole are plotting to take them out one by one with a baseball bat. But they won't know from which direction they'll be coming. I don't really know. All I know is that he said the bottom line about 482 times in this one promo, And I thought, is this where Austin got the idea for his promo material 10 years later? Hard to imagine that Steve Austin would have been studying White Lightning Tim Horner, of all people, getting inspiration from his promo work. The only thing they had in common was that they both had blonde hair at one point. Ole also ran down all the horsemen and told them to be on the lookout because Ole taught them everything they know. And with the power of Ole and White Lightning, they'll be a force to be reckoned with. Perhaps in a parallel universe. I don't ever think I've heard Ole say the words doggone before. Hopefully never again. But that was just me nitpicking more than anything. And here's everything I wrote down about this next promo with the Russians. Ivan and Pietrov are still pissed at the superpowers. Actually, Ivan is still pissed. Pietrov is facially indifferent and or puzzled. Yet to really figure out what his deal is. I think they also want a Russian chain match with Dusty and Nikita. Moving along, though, very briefly, Brad Armstrong wrestled Randy Barber, and you can pretty much cut and paste anything and everything you've ever heard me say about a Brad Armstrong match and pin it here. He wrestled, he worked a body limb, it was fine but relatively uninteresting, and he won with the leg sweep takeover. It's like, I don't know, it's so weird. You hear so many people talk about Brad Armstrong and the whole dilemma about his career in wrestling. The fact that he was the workhorse of the Armstrong family and he was actually quite the personality off camera. And then for whatever reason, it just never translated on camera. He was a very competent professional wrestler. Nothing he ever did was wrong. But the realization eventually hits you where you're like, yeah, he was a sound wrestler, but that's basically all he ever was. And it sucks too, especially if you go back and look at a lot of his work in Mid-South in like 84. Holy cow, that guy was a hot babyface at one point. Great young kid with a great look, all the potential in the world. It's like you're waiting to see him break out of his shell later on in his career. He had a lot of the tools, and they never really facilitated. He was just sort of the same Brad Armstrong from the time he started until the day his career ended, unfortunately. And even seeing him out there with his dad, Bullet Bob, like, we just covered how awesome that match was with Tully and Luger from the 87 Crockett Cup. That was one of my favorite matches out of the entire brackets. Most of the greatness coming from the work with Bullet Bob and Tully. Brad and Luger were unfortunately kind of background players for a lot of it. But, even seeing Bullet Bob and Brad out there doing promos together, it was all Bullet Bob on the stick, man. That guy was such a clever spitfire when it came to promo material. And meanwhile, Brad was just kind of mid. And this was far from the best Bullet Bob promo I've ever heard. I mean, most of it you couldn't pick up on because the crowd kept drowning him out. But they were mainly out there to throw their names into the hat for the U.S. Tag Title Tournament. They said they made it farther than they expected for the Crockett Cup. Proved to them that they have an opportunity to capitalize on an even greater chance of becoming champions together. A father-son duo. Actually, we don't really see a whole lot of that in the business. But, and again, I have nothing against Brad. Great athlete, great talent in his heyday. But the more I see of him on these Crockett shows, it all just kind of circulates back to the conversation of him missing that one tool that really could have put him over the top as a world champion. Even with the teasing of him going toe-to-toe with Ric Flair on occasion, they did angles with him. They shot TV. They had something going there. Kind of got shuffled into the background because of the Crockett Cup stuff, but man, for a brief period of time, they may have had something if they stuck the course with that program for a while longer. But obviously we know that they had bigger plans in store for Rick down the road in terms of his world title run. Speaking of said plans, Ron Garvin was out to wrestle next. He beat some geek named Tiny Beeson, who was neither tiny nor whatever the fuck a beeson is supposed to be. Fucking David Crockett, dude. I can never get enough of this guy. Fuck anybody that ever said this man was a rotten commentator. This man is a joy. Every week on this show, he makes it worthwhile. Just the idea that he's a total mark for anything that Ron Garvin ever did, and he's just biasly calling his matches and pleading for him to beat the shit out of the job guys every week, never gets old. Like a minute into this thing, Ron Garvin drops Beeson with a clubbing blow to the chest, and right as he goes for the pin, David Crockett just screams, "No, don't pin him! Beat him up!" You never hear commentators do that stuff anymore. I think David may have been the only one that could have gotten away with it too. Make him suffer. That was a David quote. It's like for every Ronnie Garvin match we ever see. Make him suffer. You know, Garvin's in there putting the guy in sugar hold, smacking him around, just having his way with him, and David's just having a ball calling it. Just the idea that he's living vicariously through Ronnie, because he wants to see him do the same thing to Jim Cornette in that cage. That's the ultimate payoff. And for the record, Ronnie did not hold back from beating the shit out of this dweeb. He's out there smacking him clean across the face, clawing at his back, headbutting him as hard as humanly possible. At one point, he actually rode Beeson like a horse. Started slapping his ass. He also jiggled his tummy and pinched his nipples at one point, which the crowd enjoyed a little too much. And then he finally decked him with a knockout punch for the 3. It was by far the most fun Ronnie's ever had in his entire career. Also probably the most fun David's ever had at calling a match. And admittedly so. Take out the nipple pinching and the horse riding and the weird fetish-like crap that was going on here. Definitely one of the highlights of this week's show. No doubt about that. Almost as good as watching the Road Warriors come out and ram through Dexter Westcott and Rick Sullivan in like 20 seconds. Now, this was less about toying with the job guys and more so just about dudes getting killed in short order. And while the finishing Doomsday device is always fun to see, I think my favorite part of this match was the visual of seeing Hawk press up Westcott over his head. And while Hawk is holding him up in the air, Westcott's arms and legs are stretched out like an airplane. Looked like a dad playing with his son in the backyard. Except here, Hawk actually slammed Westcott to the ground. Probably broke his back. David Crockett was also a complete mark during this match, which was again very entertaining to listen to. And after the Legion of Doom won, they did a promo at the booth where Hawk joked about getting a call from a Surgeon General, thanking the Road Warriors for all the patience he's racked up. To which I then asked, did Hawk basically just admit to running around killing innocent people in the streets, trying to put them in an iron lung? Really wasn't sure what he was getting at there. Aside from that, though, they basically took a couple minutes to plug the big 8-man tag in Daytona and Phoenix, with the Legion of Doom teaming up with Dusty and Nikita to face the members of the Four Horsemen. Whew. Talk about an all-star collection of talents right there. And poor Horsemen. Speaking of the Horsemen, up next was Lex Luger versus Larry Clark, which I really didn't have a whole lot to note about. Aside from the one woman in the studio that popped the crowd by shouting, and I quote, "You're not Hogan?" At which point I said, probably should have told Vince that in '93. Could have saved him a lot of time and effort. You're not Hogan. That Luger was not. He certainly had a better finish than Hogan did. And while the Horsemen are dealing with their separate business, Luger is still gunning for Nikita in the U.S. heavyweight title. JJ's out there talking about how Nikita's grown soft with the whole superpowers mantra. And meanwhile, he's got Luger eyeing him and the title. Luger actually did a moderately decent promo here, per the standards of where he was in '86 on the microphone, talking about how there are very few wrestlers that can write their own script and dictate their own future. Luger's accomplished a lot in a very short window, but the only thing that's missing is a set of gold around his waist. And with the path to destruction he's been on currently, nothing is going to stop him from beating Nikita for the U.S. Heavyweight Championship. Or as Luger stated here, U.S. Heavyweight title. You know who didn't lay a path of destruction in the world of wrestling? The New Breed. They were out there next to wrestle Chance McQuaid and Larry Stevens, and by golly did it suck a wet cock. For the short bit we actually saw the match, because I think they strategically hid most of this match behind a commercial plug. I believe David's exact quote as they came back from break. We see Chris Champion coming off the ropes and hitting one of the job guys with a sort of a clothesline. And when David Crockett has trouble figuring out what the intent of a move is supposed to be, boy howdy, not a good sign. They also nearly butchered their finishing jackhammer crossbody combo. I believe this was the second straight occasion where Champion nearly lost his footing from the top rope and came very close to eating shit on the mat. And beyond the fact that these guys are greener than a pepper tree by this point in their careers, the fucking look, dude. I can't get over how hideous it was. The awful hippy-dippy looking ring trunks with the weird outlandish hairdos. Like I said last week, it's like these guys were trying so hard to be retro characters without having any of the charisma to get over something like that. But there's a reason this gimmick didn't last all that long. I mean, even I remember seeing old clips of these guys back in the day, and I'm like, what the hell are they trying to be? It's like a wacky 80s version of the Young Bucks without all the trampoline flips. And then there was the promo that followed. A promo segment with a New Breed that was so ungodly wretched, yet so oddly hilarious at the same time. Made fucking Paul Jones look like Roddy Piper out there. I honestly can't do this justice. I stupidly didn't record the audio before I started the podcast. Trust me when I say, though, it was bad. Like, WCW 2000 level bad. Like, Jade Cargill debut level bad. Big Mama and Jimmy Valiant hanging out in the streets before Starrcade 86 bad. You got Sean Royal doing his weird Hawk impersonation out there, basically trying to imitate his promo from earlier on. And that was only noteworthy because I could actually hear what Sean was saying for more than 50% of the promo. The rest of it was incoherent psychobabble that really couldn't pick up on anything. Something involving Jimmy Valiant and Lasertron and the Rock and Roll Express. And immediately it hit me as soon as they brought up the fucking Lasertron thing. I said, oh no, the robot. I've seen clips of that on YouTube. Is that coming up? Oh, I'm going to have a ball covering that one. The infamous robot skit that forever buried Jim Cornette on television for having been associated with it. If you have no idea what I'm referring to, either look it up yourself to spare yourself the horror, or just take the ride with me until we get to it. I don't know when it happens, but I know it's coming down the road. And it would seem that in the meantime, we're about to see the New Breed feud with Handsome Jimmy and Hector Guerrero under another bad gimmick. Is this about to become the 1987 version of the Paul Jones Army? Where we're about to suffer through a bunch of wacky TV segments with a bunch of cartoon characters acting like numbskulls every week? Trying to get over that they're from the future and that they're time travelers? Because that's what the New Breed were. Sent from the year 2002 to save the world of professional wrestling. If only these guys weren't retired by 2002. They could have made a big comeback in the dying days of WCW before they closed down. See, that's what the last episode of Nitro needed. They needed the New Breed to make a cameo appearance to swoop in and save the company. Sure, it would have been right up the alleyway for all the bad ideas they came up with during the last 2 years of existence. Maybe these guys could have saved it. Who really knows? But let's get off the New Breed talking point before I give myself a brain aneurysm. Up next, we had Ole Anderson and Tim Horner versus Bill Tabb and Vernon Deaton. Just the weirdest combination team right now on this show is this Ole Anderson-Tim Horner alliance that seemingly just kind of popped up from out of nowhere. Not that they're a bad makeshift team or anything, but why do I have no memory of this ever existing? My recollection of Ole is that the Horsemen kicked him out of the group, and that was the last we ever saw of Ole for a while. I totally forgot about the Tim Horner tag team. And the whole thing's funny too, because they weren't even partners in the Crockett Cup. If you remember, Ole ended up working the cage match with Big Bubba, and I forget, I think Horner's partner was Mike Rotunda. But they established that Horner was going to watch Ole's back because, well, he's also had run-ins with the Horsemen before. I mean, it makes you kind of wonder why they're building up to a Horsemen versus Superpowers and Road Warriors 8-man tag if Ole and Horner were not going to be factored into the equation somehow. Now, granted, it would be a step down, arguably, in terms of talent pool, but at least it would have story tie-in. But, yeah. Ole Anderson and Tim Horner. That's a weird pairing. But they won that match. And then we cut to the booth for a Nikita Koloff promo. First time seeing either of the Crockett Cup winners on this show in any capacity. And, well, that was the first thing he and Tony discussed. Nikita talked about how proud he was to take home the trophy with Dusty and represent America. But he also acknowledges that a lot of people are issuing challenges right now. Whether it's Ivan and Pietrov winning the Russian chain match with him and Dusty. Whether it's Dick Murdoch hanging out in the periphery, waiting to pick his spot. Even the big bad Lex Luger trying to stake his claim for a U.S. title shot. Nikita's basically on board for any and all comers, but when it comes to Luger challenging for Nikita's title, he wants Luger to remember that in order for Luger to become the champion, he has to beat Nikita, and that will not be an easy task. Then coming back from break, we had Slick Rick out for a promo. Also promoted for this show earlier was that Flair was going to be wrestling. So here he is already decked out in his blue robe, saying that while he's getting ready for Jimmy Garvin, he's also dealing with the fact that Precious is in hiding right now, even though we all know how much Precious craves the notoriety and the attention. All the things that women desire in the world, Ric Flair holds it in the palm of his hand. Yet Jimmy Garvin's keeping her at bay, which means that Flair has no choice but to eliminate Garvin from the picture. That way he can have easy access to Precious. And on the other side of that coin, there's Bullet Bob running his mouth and bragging about how Brad Armstrong is clearly capable of taking down Flair for the title. While Brad has guts and heart, he's also got to walk the aisle and prove that he can back up all that talk by beating Flair. So we'll see how Brad fares in that environment. Meanwhile, Flair's got a message for the Road Warriors and the Superpowers, telling them they've got a date with the Four Horsemen. And for Hawk, the last thing he's going to be seeing in that match is the ceiling lights when he's laying flat on his back and Arn's paintbrushing him across the face. And in the meantime, well, we can all apparently buy a custom-made Ric Flair robe for the affordable price of $10,500. Pocket change to the world champion. For some, probably about a quarter of their yearly salary, if they're lucky. Pays to be rich, though. Speaking of Arn paintbrushing Hawk, he paintbrushed the Italian Stallion for a few minutes here. Actually, it was more so the other way around for a minute there. It was Stallion working over Arn and catching him with some early offense. And after Arn caught him with a boot in the corner, he had a very sloppy-looking gourd buster for the 3 count. Barely got Stallion 2 feet off the ground. And then he went to the booth for a follow-up interview with David. And we just got done talking about that Arn Anderson promo on Dynamite. Here he is in 1987, firing on all cylinders, drawing a lot of talking points back to Barry Windham, saying when it comes to who rises to the top of the pecking order right now, Windham's the guy that gets thrown around. And while he's had his share of matches with Flair around the country, when it came time to prove that he can sell himself as the top of the food chain in Crockett Promotions, he fell short of the mark. The Horsemen are the measuring stick in this sport, and while they can boast about having the finest cars, suits, and gadgets, when it comes to pure wrestling, their goal is to ensure that the world's heavyweight title stays with the Horsemen, by hook or by crook. And when people try to convince Arn that Barry's the number 1 contender for the belt, it makes Arn sick to his stomach. He takes it as an insult, because it makes people think that Barry is above Arn in the ring as an athlete. And if Barry thinks he's the man, he needs to beat Arn to prove it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that 2 or 3 minute snippet right there, that is promo class 101 from Arn Anderson. Legend and all-time great. Free of charge for all the young rookies out there that have easy access to watch all this crap on the internet. In their leisure time, they can sit down and learn how to be well-rounded workers in the business by, God forbid, watching a 2-minute Arn Anderson promo. It's interesting how very few will capitalize on that. Probably because they're too busy watching PWG Spot Fest and GCW hardcore bloodbaths. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here watching Ric Flair take Brody Chase to school with a good old-fashioned wrestling clinic. Although I will admit here, the rare times we actually get to see Rick wrestle on TV and his opponent is Brody Chase, you couldn't just have him wrestle Mike Jackson or a Mulkey brother. Yeah, whatever. Probably the only time you'll ever see a Ric Flair dominant squash, where he controls like 95% of the match and doesn't sell for a lot of it. I mean, it only went a few minutes, but it was fun while it lasted. Listening to him catcall Precious every few seconds, just classic Nature Boy stuff right there. But after that was over, they spent some time showing the highlight reel of the 87 Crockett Cup. I think they ended up covering footage from every team in the tournament, including all the prelim rounds. And again, I highly encourage you all to go out of your way to check out my report on some of the higher profile matches on that show. Guess it would have been 2 weeks ago on the Monday podcast, although I'd have to look it up right now if I wanted to be completely accurate, but I think it was 2 weeks ago. Obviously, we didn't cover every match, just the high points, but it was a fun review. I still wish we would have access to the old WWE Network footage so we can see more of the content out there instead of the YouTube reduction footage. But even so, getting to see some of that raw footage in the crowd with just the fan reaction and no commentary, again, we talked about it at the time, but it really changes the perspective when you go back and you watch these old classic tapes, getting to hear the room and sort of put yourself in the position of what it was like to be around that space at the time. You really don't see stuff like that anymore in the business, at least with the way it's presented on television. You know, unless you're actually at a house show or live in person and you don't hear the commentary over the speakers and all the production stuff going on. It's really the only time you can see this stuff again. And even so, crowds are nowhere near as hot for wrestling nowadays as they were back in the day. Even AEW crowds are not as electric as some of these old crowds were in the territory days. And I'll argue that with people until the day they put me in the grave. But, you know, that was only about 3 or 4 minutes altogether. Just a real quick highlight package to piece everything together and move along with the show. We had a Lasertron versus Daryl Dalton match, just sort of wedged into the middle of the show to eat up some time. Hector went over with a flying elbow attack off the ropes in like 2 minutes. And then we went to the booth for another wacky segment. We talked about how the New Breed promo was very unstable and bizarre as fuck. Ain't nothing gets more unstable and bizarre than the Boogie Woogie Man. Standing there talking about God knows what. Trying to insinuate that everybody's been talking about Lasertron. To which I said, no, we haven't. Saying that Lasertron was a good pussin'. He's a people pussin'. He loves the children. Don't call the authorities. And, well, obviously the New Breed came up in conversation earlier when it came to Handsome Jimmy and Lasertron, so they were here to return the favor, sort of. Boogeyman saying that he and Lasertron have been on the top of the mountain looking both ways, at which point Jimmy stopped to turn his head to the left, turn his head to the right, and then he continued his promo. I laughed at that. He said something about being through the Yippies, Punk Rockers, and the New Wavers, but the New Breed ain't got nothing on the Boogie Woogie Man's music hit. If only Jimmy was around longer to see the grunge or garage band era of music. What would he have to say about Nirvana? Talk about counterculture. Oh yeah, and Jimmy molested Tony Schiavone again. Nothing out of the ordinary there. And then gorgeous Jimmy Garvin beats some guy named Billy Moore with a brainbuster in like 10 seconds. Follow that with a promo at the booth with Precious, who apparently was now out of hiding. And he was doing the obvious babyface promo on Flair, saying that Flair may have thought he could easily run off gorgeous Jimmy, but it's like Jimmy said last week. He's not afraid of Rick or the Horsemen. He says it's not his fault that he's got the hottest squeeze in the world. To which I said, well, I mean, it kind of is. You picked her to be your wife. It's not like she just landed on your doorstep one day via FedEx. Anyway, I said it won't be his fault when he takes the World Heavyweight title from Rick. He's got the heart, the guts, and the mindset to beat Rick. And while Flair might think he can walk around and trash talk all the women he comes across and treat the whole world like it's his meat market, gorgeous Jimmy is there to shut the market down. He also kept calling Flair Pally again, which is still not over with me. Neither is babyface Jimmy Garvin, but I already think I kind of talked about that before. Love Jimmy Garvin, big fan of his, but yeah, the babyface run, not feeling it, Mr. Krabs. I mean, he's trying, not for lack of effort. I just prefer heel Jimmy Garvin and heel Precious. I mean, I think the dynamics worked a lot better on TV. Kind of like how Tully and JJ worked phenomenally as heels on TV. Thankfully, they were never booked as babyfaces in Crockett. And, no, JJ was out there to put over the Crockett Cup, as he did Tully Blanchard. And while Tully's talking about calling the shots and being at the top of the mountain as the world's television champion, he begins name-dropping some of his former rivals, mainly Dusty Rhodes and Magnum TA. But there's one name that he and JJ keep hearing muttered about, and that man is none other than Ricky Morton. To which I said, "Oh, really? They've been bringing him up in conversation?" Because the Rock and Roll Express have kind of been a non-entity on this show in the last several months. Anyway, he talks about how while he and Robert are walking around without tag team gold, it's obvious that Ricky is looking to cash in his chips for a shot at singles gold again. The only problem for Ricky is that the last time he got into a scuffle with the Horsemen didn't end so well for him. He ended up walking around with a face guard for the better part of 4 or 5 months. But if Ricky's up to the challenge again, Tully's not hard to find. And for the rest of the babyfaces that want to step up to the plate, the Horsemen have their number 2. And from there, we had our TV main event for the week. The Barbarian in singles action, crushing Clement Fields, which was a fun mass beatdown. All the while, Tony Schiavone's out there reading greeting cards and talking about how great the fans are. And meanwhile, Barbarian's in there hoisting up Fields and dropping him on his head with a tombstone and just beating the ever-loving shit out of the guy. And then he finally went over with a diving headbutt. This went about 1.5 minutes in total. Wish they could have gave it 10 more. I could watch the Barbarian kill dudes on TV every week for like 15 minutes and never get bored. Can't say the same for most big guys, but Barbarian, most definitely. But, well, they had to squeeze in one last Midnight's promo in here before the show went off air. Right back to where we started at the top of hour 1. And actually, Cornette wasn't even the highlight of the promo. It was Sweet Stan chiming in by talking about how Ronnie Garvin can threaten Cornette all he wants, but if he tries to take Corny out with the hands of stone, the only stone he'll be seeing is the headstone above him that reads, R.I.P. That was a perfect cap to the show. What a banger of a line. And all the while, I couldn't get over the visual of seeing beautiful Bobby in a V-neck sweater. You know, we talked earlier about how the all-pink look wasn't the best choice of color for him to wear in the ring. Not really sure if I'm digging the V-neck sweater either. Maybe the standard crew neck would have sufficed. All in all, good cap to a pretty fun show overall. You know, again, you can see they're gearing up for the Great American Bash Tour. You know, some of the programs are being set in motion. You know, while there's still a little bit of void filler on the show here and there that didn't really light my world on fire, mainly the new breed, it was a very solid 2 hours of programming. Definitely better than what we normally see out of weekly 2-hour wrestling these days. Not to point out specifics. And then there's World Class Championship Wrestling, which is kind of its own entity entirely. The shows are usually never bad. There's normally plenty of stuff to talk about, more often than not. But, yeah, it's definitely a reflection of the times. Just to go back and see how different the wrestling business used to be in the 80s versus what we get with normal week-to-week programming now. Show this kind of footage to any of the young kids watching wrestling today, and they'd be chucking soda bottles and popcorn to the TV going, "This is so boring. When's Chris Jericho going to show up and light a fireball in somebody's face? When's somebody going to show up with a tank and come barreling through the back door of the arena to run over all the job guys? I want to see mayhem. I want to see chaos." Now that I think of it, that's what World Class was missing. They needed a fucking tank. That would have kept him in business for a little bit longer. No, actually what they needed was to not withdraw from the NWA alliance in 86. That was kind of the beginning of the end. But as I've said before, it's a conversation we'll be having as we go through the video library. We're still a couple years out from that. Now, this was an interesting show in the sense that they were not actually at the Sportatorium for this taping. They were in Denton, Texas, on the North Texas State University campus. Because apparently simplifying it to North Texas was too informal back in the day. And they had Bill Mercer out on the main campsite running down the card and kind of being awkward as he's standing there with all the campus kids walking by. Some of them probably looking on dazed and confused, thinking, what the fuck is a missing link? And what is this guy smoking right now? I'm surprised no one tried to photobomb. These days, you wouldn't be able to film this kind of stuff. Kids would be causing all kinds of ruckus. You'd have purple-haired Karens running around streaking and yelling about how wrestling is a male-privileged sport for white people. But, hey, change of scenery. It's good for world class. You know, getting away from the Sportatorium home base for a little bit and trying to branch out into some other venues. And North Texas is a fairly big campus, too. So I'm pretty sure they got a big attraction site for a lot of the young kids. Probably during spring break, too, when this was filmed. So they had plenty of eyeballs to attract. And we were at The Pit for this particular episode. Not sure if that was the name of the actual venue or if they just needed a placeholder term. But it was definitely in the shape of a pit. I mean, I'm assuming it was just the basketball court. But while I wouldn't say this was a particularly stacked card, yeah, there were a couple interesting matches in the undercard for this one. Starting right out of the gate, the opener was Super Destroyer number 1 versus, directly as they refer to him here, Lenny Poffo. Not Lanny Poffo, but Lenny Poffo. I believe the only territory that he ever went by that name, if I'm not mistaken. Because I know for a fact he wasn't Lenny Poffo in ICW or Mid-South. Same for his run in the WWF, even though he was going by the Genius moniker during his later run. Now, this was 84, so I believe he would have probably been splitting his work with Bill Watts in Mid-South. Because I don't think he went to the WWF until like 85. He may have been in Florida for a brief stint beforehand, but 84, I mean, he definitely did not get signed by Vince yet. But yes, let the record show, this was Leaping Lanny Poffo in the flesh, working an underneath match here in the opener of a world-class show in Denton, Texas. Which is why I was thinking he was probably in the Mid-South region by this point. Because ICW had already folded by this period, so unless he was doing some work in Florida, Mid-South is the only other territory I could have envisioned him being at. And, well, I know Lanny was in the news not all that long ago, obviously covering his death, which broke out in, oh God, was it January or February this year? I think it was February. And that was really sad news at the time. The first footage I ever saw of Lanny was actually the work that he did in Mid-South for that short period. I mean, I really didn't go out of my way to watch any of the WWF run until years later. You know, partially because the Genius persona wasn't really my flavor of wrestling. And I just wasn't really following the WWF around that late 80s period anyway. Definitely one of the first high-flyer type athletes that I really kind of sunk my teeth into. You know, go back and watch a lot of Poffo's work during his early career if you want to kind of get a glimpse of what the flashy ring work was like in the 70s and the early 80s. Lenny was one of the first real eye catchers around that point. And what a natural babyface that guy was, too. Great body, great size, super strong and versatile performer. And even though Poffo was mainly out there to put Super D over here and kind of advance the current Devastation Inc. program for the Texas Stadium show, this wasn't a one-sided beatdown. They let Poffo get in some offense here. Some good back-and-forth spots with both guys. Poffo did a great job selling at one point. They actually had a spot about midway through where Poffo got bumped out to the floor and Super D actually gave him a boot where Poffo took a flat back bump on the concrete. Good Lord. And these guys had more balls than I do. I never would have considered taking a back bump on the concrete like that. One wrong move and it's concussion fucking city. But these guys never held back, man. In a couple weird little clunky parts right before the comeback where both guys didn't really seem to communicate spots well, but Super D ended up going over with, and I quote, a super suplex from the top rope. I thought to myself, so we've heard Mercer refer to it as a superplex, now followed by a super suplex. I wonder what quantifies the standard super suplex from the super suplex. Maybe we can look that one up later on. But, very good opener. Really fun match. Wish I could have given it a few more minutes because Poffo was really cooking there by the point Super D cut him off and won. Again, I don't know how long Poffo sticks around in the Dallas region. I can't imagine it's that long. I mean, he was only one of Watts' mainstays for about a year or so right before Vince signed him. I remember he got a pretty big push in the undercard or mid-card scene with the Mid-South region. But, yeah, really strong opener. We'll just pretend the whole Lenny Poffo thing was a butcher on their part. We all know who Leapin' Lanny was. You didn't need to mask him under a gimmick name. Tell you who I didn't know was the guy that worked the next match with Buddy Roberts. Rock and Roll Buck Zumhoff. Never heard of him. But apparently I've been missing out because, boy, was this guy quite the character. He, I don't even know what the hell you would call this gimmick. He's like a cross between Rick Boogs and the Honky Tonk Man if Roy's gimmick was that he carried out a boombox instead of an acoustic guitar. I have no idea how I went almost my entire life never having heard of this guy in this wacky persona, but he certainly caught my attention. And here's everything that happened in this match. The bell rings almost immediately after the commercial. They just jump right into it cold. No ring intros for either guy. Buddy tries to jumpstart attack Buck. Buck fights back. Throws Buddy into the corner buckle. He hits him with a Vader splash. And he pins him clean. At which point, and probably one of the more ludicrous things we've probably seen on world-class TV since they filmed that black lady holding up the naked bloody doll on TV a few weeks ago, Buck gets on the timekeeper's table, and he does a zany promo saying, if this is how I've got to rock and roll, then that's the way it be. Or something to that degree. And I thought to myself, that was probably the damnedest thing I've ever seen on World Class. But I didn't hate it. It was quite intriguing. The whole thing lasted probably a minute and a half, if that. And then Buddy had the hissy fit in the ring because he basically just got outsmarted and beat by a comedy job guy. But, yeah. Rock and Roll Buck Zumhoff. According to his wiki page, a former professional wrestler retired in 2014. Actually ends up being a pretty big star in the world-class region up until his departure in 85. Ended up having a pretty big run in the AWA as well. Trained by Vern Gagne, which is no small feat. also a convicted sex offender. So anyway, on to the next match. It's the Missing Link beating Jerry Gray in a squash that bored me to tears. And it was so uninteresting that I decided to spend the entirety of this match reading up on the convicted sex offender, Buck Zumhofe. Because, I mean, it's hilarious for one when you go to the wiki page and before there's even a mention of his wrestling career, the first sentence reads, Eugene Otto Buck Zumhofe is a convicted sex offender and former American professional wrestler, blah, blah. I was like, well, that caught me off guard a little bit. Then I looked at the picture in the graphic where he's holding up the boombox and I said, well, actually, now that I see him, the mustache is a little suspect. Definitely a missing screw or two there. More so than the missing link. Now, I won't go into details about the sexual charges, but the story about him trying to flee from the cops at the courthouse, picture that visual in your head for a minute. But, yeah, that guy apparently winds up becoming a pretty big player in the Dallas region in the next year. In case you didn't know. So get ready for more talk on convicted felon Buck Zumhofe, who apparently did a little too much rocking and rolling during his off time. Playing that boombox a little too much to perfection. You know what I'm saying? Oh, yeah. And Missing Link won this match with Gray. He's also still missing a few brain cells. And water is wet. Then for our main event, what a main event it was. It's gorgeous Jimmy Garvin versus gentleman Chris Adams in the feud that's been going on since the birth of Adam and Eve. And yet the story continues to be less about the men involved and more so about the ultimate payoff of when we're going to see the girls rip each other's clothes off. Hasn't gotten old yet. They've been milking this fucking thing since the night Jimmy turned on Sunshine and humiliated her in front of everybody. That Sunshine press conference seems like it was an eternity ago. And what a kick-ass start to this thing. You know, Mercer's been plugging the big showdown for the David Memorial event. It's going to be a mixed tag match with Garvin and Precious going up against Adams and Sunshine. And we got a little sampler here of what the girls are going to be in store for, just to whet our appetite for the eventual showdown. Right before the bell, the girls immediately go after each other to get into the catfight, doing their best to sell this angle like these women are literally on the verge of stabbing each other with pocket knives. And I'll admit, it was one of the more convincing women's fights you'll ever see. You had David Manning out there trying to hold the girls back and send them away because Lord knows they're going to be able to control their emotions at ringside. You know, Sunshine screaming at Manning that she doesn't want to go to the back. And you got the guys trying to hold them back and prevent them from going at him multiple times here. Meanwhile, the crowd is just eating all this shit up as it's going down. You could tell all the horny guys in the crowd were having a fucking ball with this one. Strategically played. But of course, the girls end up getting sent to the back, which the crowd did not like. And finally, they were able to get the match underway. The story they had going here was that Jimmy Garvin apparently recaptured the American Heavyweight title again, which, I gotta be honest with you, I had totally forgotten that Adams was still the champion. Those guys have been playing hot potato with the belt so frequently. And again, let's be honest, the story has not been about the belt. Well, I mean, it has, but Precious and Sunshine have sort of been carrying the load. And that's not to discount the work from these guys. It was a very good match, but you know, up until the angle at the very end where the girls ran out again, truth be told, there really wasn't a whole lot to say about the work. You know, Garvin did every heel tactic in the book. Adams fought back and had the big babyface flurry. There were actually several periods during this where the audio feed started making these really high-pitched frequency sounds, so I actually had to hit the mute function for a few seconds until the noise stopped. Elsewise, I'd have been hearing ringing tones in my ear for the next 24 hours. So anyway, they wrestled for a while. Like I said, it was good. For the kind of people that hate the rest holds and the long stretches of working over body parts, this was probably a negative 5-star match to those people. But they do the big angle at the end where after Adams starts making the comeback, he hits Garvin with an elevated suplex from the ring apron, at which point, out comes Precious. Straight out of the SmackDown playbook, where after the refs spend about 8 minutes trying to kick people out from ringside for running interference, well, they just pop back out 10 minutes later and the ref just lets it happen. I literally just bitch about the same thing happening on SmackDown a week ago, and here in 1984, bitching about the same thing. So, yeah, Precious is out there, cheering on her man, allegedly. And that lasts all of about 3 seconds before she hits the ring apron in plain view of Bronco. And of course, that brings out Sunshine yet again to give chase. And while the two cherry red Jezebels are ripping at each other's hair and gouging at each other's faces. Well, actually, I have no idea what the hell happened at the finish. I think Adams pinned Garvin, but we never actually saw the finish on camera. In fact, it kind of looked like the cameraman got tripped up trying to film the girls fighting. But, yeah. At least we can say this. Sunshine and red. 5 stars. And I think it's a toss-up between the mixed tag match and the Flair Carey World title match as being the two hottest programs that we're looking forward to for that stadium event. But, yeah. It's a very fiery main event. Definitely a good way to close out the show. And like I said, I like to change the venue here. You know, North Texas brought a different kind of energy that we normally don't get with the Sportatorium. You know, and it's always kind of cool seeing new faces show up. Some of them I'll be familiar with, others not so much. It is funny how Lanny Poffo was the name that jumped right out to me when I saw him. And in the very next segment, it's Buck Zumhoff that shows up. And I'm like, who the fuck is that guy? Is that a Tony Khan signee? Yet it turns out Buck is the one that ends up getting the monster push. All kidding aside, though, if you're a fan of catfights, definitely recommend you go out of your way to watch the final segment just to see the first 3 minutes with the girls. I mean, elsewise, you're probably not missing much with the match. And if you like seeing Buddy Roberts get jacked around, watching him lose a 10-second match to rock and roll Buck Zumhoff, that ought to put a smile on your face. But, yeah, that was a Dallas show. We got a few weeks from the Texas Stadium event, so they're piecing together a card relatively well. Can't really complain about that. So anyway, I think we're about ready to wrap things up for this one. Now that's in the back of my mind, I know WWE has a premium live special coming up soon. When is that show? No, I don't want WrestleMania 39. I want to see where WrestleMania Backlash is. Here we go. That is taking place on Saturday, May the 6th. So we're still a little ways, well, a couple weeks, I guess. Yeah, a couple weeks away from that. As of right now, I don't know what's on that card. I guess I can take a peek real quick. Of course, fucking Bad Bunny's the featured image on the poster. You got 2 matches announced right now. Cody Rhodes and Brock Lesnar, which I think is pretty well established. They kind of set that up after WrestleMania. And then we got the 6-man tag. Riddle, Owens, and Zayn versus the Bloodline, which I pretty much called. And that's kind of where we're at right now. I mean, just those 2 matches, it's not horrible or anything. But the jury is still out on that whole decision to not put the title on Cody. I know people are still trying to defend it and looking for any excuse to let the field play out or whatever, but I don't know, dude. I mean, WWE's kind of lowered my expectations to the point where I really don't have expectations at this point. I just presume that they're never going to give me a satisfying payoff, and I sulk about it for a little bit, and then I move on. Because in the world of professional wrestling, Lord knows we can never get a happy ending. That's a conversation for another time. I'm going to sign out there. Thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure to subscribe, comment, all that good stuff, and check us out either on Rumble or YouTube. There are always links for both, so you pick your poison. And we'll be back on the Monday show for the Retro Raw and the SmackDown report. No bells and whistles attached. Take care. Peace out.